Did the entire Pacific War really hinge on 5 minutes of battle? How could an empire undefeated for months suddenly lose its momentum in a single day? The Japanese naval forces seemed unstoppable in early 1942. They had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They controlled a vast territory. But then came the Battle of Midway from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. After those few days, everything changed. But Japan would never again launch a major offensive. The United States, which had been on the defensive since the war began, took control. Was Midway just one important victory, or was it the single event that decided the outcome of the war in the Pacific? It wasn't just about ships sinking, it was about losing things that could never be replaced. It was about psychology, industry, strategy, and luck. Here are the reasons why those few days in June 1942 were the true pivot point. Number 15, was this the end of Japan's victory diseases? Before Midway, Japan had known nothing but success. The attack on the American naval base in Hawaii was a tactical triumph. They took the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Their naval and air forces seemed invincible. This string of victories created a problem. It was a psychological problem called Shori-Byo, or victory diseases. The symptoms are overconfidence, arrogance, and a tendency to underestimate the enemy. Japanese military planners started to believe their own hype. They thought they were spiritually and tactically superior. This mindset directly influenced the Midway plan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, devised a complex operation. It involved multiple fleets spread out over hundreds of miles of ocean. The idea was to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them. The plan was too complicated. It relied on perfect timing and assumed the Americans would act exactly as predicted. As historian John Parshall notes in his book, Shattered Sword, the Japanese plan had very little room for error. It was a plan born of confidence, not caution. The leaders on the front line were also affected. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the 1st Air Fleet, the main carrier strike force. During the battle, he made several critical decisions based on the assumption of superiority. He assumed the American fleet was not yet near. He assumed a second strike on Midway Atoll was more important than preparing for a naval battle. When his scout planes were delayed, he was not overly concerned. The victory disease led him and his staff to ignore warning signs. They dismissed a report of American ships as probably cruisers and destroyers, not the carriers they were hunting. This overconfidence was a stark contrast to the American mindset. The Americans were fighting for survival. They were the underdogs. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the U.S. Pacific Fleet commander, was cautious but decisive. His commanders at sea, Rear Admirals Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond A. Spruance, were focused and willing to take calculated risks. They knew they could not afford a mistake. There was no arrogance on the American side, only a desperate need to win. The defeat at Midway was a brutal shock to the Japanese military system. It shattered the myth of invincibility. For the first time, they had suffered a major, undeniable defeat. The news was so devastating that it was kept secret from the Japanese public and even from many in the government. The survivors were isolated to prevent word from spreading, but within the Navy, the truth was known. The psychological blow was immense. The confidence that had fueled their expansion was gone. It was replaced by a grim, defensive reality. This shift in mindset was as important as any ship lost. The victory disease was cured, but the treatment was fatal to their war aims. How did the pilots who survived and were sworn to secrecy cope with the knowledge of such a disaster? And if Japan had been more cautious, less afflicted by its string of successes, would it have ever conceived a plan as risky as Midway in the first place? Number 14, did Japan lose its best in a single day? A carrier is a steel box. An airplane is a collection of metal and wires, but the pilot is the heart of the weapon. In 1942, Japan had some of the best naval aviators in the world. They were an elite group, hardened by years of rigorous training and combat experience over China. This was the Koku Sentai, the carrier air groups of the 1st Air Fleet. They were the ones who had executed the devastating strikes from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. They were, in a very real sense, irreplaceable. The Battle of Midway didn't just sink 4 carriers. It wiped out the core of this elite force. Japan lost over 100 experienced pilots in the battle. That number might not sound huge, but it represented a massive loss of skill and leadership. These were not just rookie pilots. They were flight leaders, squadron commanders, and veteran aces who had been flying and fighting for years. And men like Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who led the strike from the carrier Hiryu, even though he knew his plane didn't have enough fuel to return. His experience was invaluable. When he died, that experience died with him. Japan's pilot training program was a major weakness. It was long, brutal, and produced very few pilots each year. It focused on creating a small number of perfect aviators rather than a large number of competent ones. The system could not handle high attrition. The United States, by contrast, had a massive training pipeline. As noted in books like The First Team by John B. Lundstrom, the U.S. Navy was already ramping up a program that would produce tens of thousands of pilots over the course of the war. They could absorb losses and replace them, even if the replacements were initially less experienced. After Midway, Japan could not regenerate its carrier air groups to the same level of quality. They had to rush new pilots through training. These new pilots lacked the experience, the skill, and the confidence of the pre-war veterans. You can see this decline in subsequent battles. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, a new generation of Japanese pilots faced experienced American aviators. The result was what the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost hundreds of planes and pilots with very few American losses. The skill gap had become a chasm. The loss at Midway was a generational loss. It was the end of the original elite strike force that had projected Japanese power across the Pacific. The planes could be replaced, though, slowly. New carriers could eventually be built, but the combat knowledge stored in the minds of those 100 or so pilots who were killed or went down with their ships was gone forever. It was a brain drain at 300 knots. The Japanese Navy would fight on for 3 more years, but its air arm never recovered from the blow it suffered on June 4th, 1942. Several questions about this loss of expertise remain unanswered. We don't have a perfect count of exactly which pilots were lost and what their specific experience levels were. How much faster did the quality of Japanese naval aviation decline because of this single event? And could Japan have won later battles if even half of those Midway veterans had somehow survived? Number 13, could Japan's factories ever catch up? That war is not just about battles, it's about production, it's about a nation's ability to build planes, ships, and guns, and to replace them when they are lost. In this area, the United States had a massive, overwhelming advantage over Japan. The Battle of Midway brought this industrial disparity into sharp focus. It was the moment the bill for Japan's limited industrial capacity came due. In 1941, when the war began, Japan's Navy was in some ways superior to the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Its ships were excellent. Its planes, like the Mitsubishi A6M-0, were world-class, and its crews were highly trained. But this was a force built for a short, sharp war. Japan's leaders gambled that they could win a decisive victory early on and force a negotiated peace before America's industrial might could be fully mobilized. They knew they could not win a long war of attrition. Midway was the battle that guaranteed a long war. Japan lost 4 of its best fleet carriers in 2 days: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the core of the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force. In the 3 years after Midway, Japan managed to commission only 6 more fleet and light carriers. During that same period, the United States commissioned over a dozen fleet carriers and over 80 smaller escort carriers. The numbers are staggering. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, a single fleet, had more air power than the entire Japanese Navy had at the start of the war. The story is the same for aircraft. Japan struggled to replace the hundreds of planes lost at Midway and in the battles that followed. Its aircraft industry was smaller and less efficient than America's. It also faced growing shortages of raw materials like oil and aluminum as the American submarine campaign began to strangle its supply lines. The United States, safe from attack, turned its civilian industries into a massive arsenal. Factories that once made cars started making bombers. The production numbers were astronomical. The loss of the 4 carriers at Midway was a blow from which Japanese industry could not recover. They simply did not have the shipyards, the steel, or the skilled labor to replace those ships in a timely manner. The United States, on the other hand, was just getting started. The Essex-class carriers, which would form the backbone of the U.S. fleet for the rest of the war, were already under construction. The first of them, USS Essex, was commissioned in December 1942, just 6 months after Midway. Midway exposed the fundamental weakness of Japan's war strategy. It rested on the flawed assumption that the United States would not have the will to fight a long, grinding war. By losing its offensive punch at Midway, Japan lost the ability to control the pace of the war. It was forced onto the defensive, buying time it did not have against an enemy that grew stronger every single day. The battle was a turning point, not just on the ocean, but on the factory floor. Key questions about the Industrial War still intrigue historians. If Japan had won at Midway and sunk 2 American carriers, would this have delayed the U.S. counteroffensive enough to change their long-term production plans? To what extent did Japanese military leaders understand their own industrial inferiority before the war? And was there any alternative strategy Japan could have pursued that did not depend on a decisive battle against an industrial giant? Number 12. Did one raid seal an empire's fate? Sometimes a small event can cause a huge reaction. The Doolittle Raid on April 18, 1942 was one of those events. On paper, the raid did very little physical damage. 16 B-25 medium bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet dropped a few bombs on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. It was a pinprick. But the psychological and strategic impact was enormous, and it led directly to the Battle of Midway. For the American public, the raid was a huge morale boost. After months of bad news, here was a sign that America could strike back. For Japan, it was a profound shock and humiliation. The military had promised the emperor that the home islands were untouchable. The raid proved that promise was false. American bombers had flown over the emperor's palace. This was an unacceptable loss of face. The Japanese Navy, in particular, was tasked with protecting the nation from seaborne attack. They had failed. Admiral Yamamoto was furious. He had been arguing for an operation to destroy the American carriers for some time. The Doolittle Raid gave him the leverage he needed. He argued to the high command that the U.S. carriers were a direct threat to the homeland and had to be eliminated at all costs. Any opposition to his plan for a decisive battle at Midway melted away. The raid created a sense of urgency and a desire for revenge that clouded strategic judgment. As historian H.P. Wilmot argues in The Barrier and the Javelin, the Midway operation was fundamentally a reaction to the Doolittle Raid. The raid also directly influenced Japanese planning for Midway. They believed the B-25s had been launched from Midway Atoll, not from a carrier. This reinforced their belief that taking Midway was essential to create a defensive perimeter to protect Japan. The plan was not just to sink the American fleet, but also to seize the atoll. This dual objective complicated the operation and divided their forces. So a raid that was militarily insignificant became strategically decisive. It pushed the Japanese Navy into a hasty, complex, and ultimately disastrous operation. It was a classic case of an emotional reaction overriding cool-headed planning. Without the Doolittle Raid, would Yamamoto have been able to get his Midway plan approved? Maybe not. The Army was more focused on operations in China and the South Pacific. The Navy might have been directed to pursue a more cautious attritional strategy. But the sight of American bombers over Tokyo changed everything. It set a collision course for Midway. The 16 bombers that took off from the Hornet may not have won the war, but they set the stage for the battle that did. We still wonder about the true debates within the Japanese high command. How much real opposition was there to Yamamoto's plan before the Doolittle Raid? Did any senior officers warn that the raid was a trap designed to provoke a reckless response? And what if the raid had failed, with all the bombers crashing into the sea before reaching Japan? Would the Pacific War have unfolded on a completely different timeline? Number 11. How did a failed attack in the North help win in the South? The Japanese plan for the Midway operation was famously complex. It was not just one attack, but two. While the main carrier force steamed towards Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific, another, smaller force was sent far to the north. Their mission was to attack the Aleutian Islands, a chain of remote, fog-shrouded islands belonging to the United States off the coast of Alaska. The Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor and occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska. On the surface, this northern operation was a success. and it was the first time American soil had been occupied by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812, but strategically it was a major blunder. It was designed as a diversion. Yamamoto hoped the attack on the Aleutians would draw part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet north, away from the main battle at Midway. This would weaken the American force and make it easier for his main fleet to achieve a decisive victory. The problem was, the diversion failed. Admiral Nimitz was not fooled. Thanks to his codebreakers, he knew Midway was the real target. He had read Yamamoto's mail. He knew the Aleutian attack was a sideshow. As a result, Nimitz refused to take the bait. He kept his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, concentrated in the Central Pacific, exactly where they needed to be to ambush the Japanese fleet. He sent only a small force of cruisers and destroyers north to deal with the Aleutians. The Japanese decision to split their forces was a violation of a key military principle: concentration of force. Yamamoto divided his fleet when he should have been concentrating it. The carrier force sent to the Aleutians, centered on the light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, was not available to fight in the main battle at Midway. While their presence might not have changed the final outcome, their aircraft and screening ships would have been very useful to Admiral Nagumo. For example, they could have provided better reconnaissance or a stronger combat air patrol over the Japanese fleet. The Aleutian operation was a waste of resources. It tied up valuable ships, planes, and men in a secondary theater of war. The occupation of Attu and Kiska turned into a logistical nightmare for the Japanese, and the islands were eventually retaken by U.S. forces in 1943 at a high cost. In the context of the Midway battle, the diversion not only failed to deceive the Americans, but also weakened the main Japanese effort. It was a self-inflicted wound, a product of a plan that was too clever and too complicated for its own good. As naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote, the whole Aleutian affair was a mistake and a waste of effort. It was a feint that only succeeded in weakening the body blow that was supposed to follow. Lingering questions about this northern sideshow persist. Was there anyone in the Japanese high command who argued against splitting the fleet? How much did the Aleutian attack actually strain Japanese logistics that could have supported the main fleet? And if the U.S. had not broken the codes, would Nimitz have fallen for the diversion and sent his carriers north, leading to a catastrophic defeat at Midway? Number 10. What if? The Japanese had found the American fleet first. Victory in a carrier battle often comes down to one thing: finding and striking the enemy before they find and strike you. At Midway, the Japanese reconnaissance plan was a complete failure. This failure was a key reason for their defeat. They went into battle effectively blind, while the Americans knew exactly where they were. The Japanese plan called for a 2-phase reconnaissance screen to locate the American carriers. The first phase involved long-range flying boats operating from a spot called French Frigate Shoals. This plan was canceled when a Japanese submarine discovered an American warship was already there. No alternative was put in place. The second phase relied on 7 scout planes launched from Nagumo's carriers on the morning of the battle. This part of the plan was plagued by delays and bad luck. One of the scout planes from the heavy cruiser Tone was delayed by 30 minutes due to a catapult problem. This was the plane assigned to search the very sector where the American carriers were located. Because of this delay, by the time the Tone scout plane finally spotted the American fleet, it was too late. Nagumo had already made the fatal decision to rearm his planes with bombs for a second strike on Midway Island instead of with torpedoes for an attack on ships. His flight decks were chaotic, with bombs and torpedoes stacked everywhere. Even when the scout plane did make its report, the information was incomplete. The first message simply said, 10 enemy ships. It did not mention a carrier. The follow-up message identifying a carrier came much later. This ambiguity and delay cost the Japanese precious time. In contrast, American reconnaissance was superb. U.S. Navy PBY Catalina flying boats based on Midway spotted the Japanese fleet early in the morning. This gave the American carriers the critical information they needed: the location, course, and speed of their enemy. The failure was not just about bad luck with one catapult. It was a systemic problem. The Japanese search patterns were not as thorough as they could have been. There was a sense of complacency. Nagumo's staff, suffering from the victory disease, did not expect the American carriers to be there. They were more focused on the attack on Midway. As Parshall and Tully detail in Shattered Sword, the Japanese had no dedicated scout planes on their carriers. They used attack planes for reconnaissance, which was not their primary role. The Americans, with their PBYs and carrier-based SBD Dauntless dive bombers, had a much more robust system for finding the enemy. If the Tone scout plane had launched on time, it would have spotted the U.S. fleet much earlier. Nagamo would have received the news while his planes were still armed with torpedoes from the first strike. He could have launched an immediate attack. In that scenario, the battle could have gone very differently. The American carriers might have been the ones caught vulnerable with their planes on deck. The failure of Japanese reconnaissance was not a minor detail. It was a central reason why the turning point of the Pacific War happened the way it did. The what-ifs surrounding the reconnaissance failures are haunting. What exactly caused the catapult on the Tone to malfunction at that specific moment? Why didn't Nagamo launch a more comprehensive search pattern as a precaution, even if he didn't expect the U.S. fleet to be present? And how much of the scout pilot's delayed and vague reporting was due to technical issues versus human error under pressure? Number 9. Did a broken code decide the Pacific War? Information is ammunition. At the Battle of Midway, the most powerful weapon the United States had was not a carrier or an airplane, but a small, windowless basement in Hawaii. This was Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit. Led by the brilliant and eccentric Commander Joseph J. Rochefort, this team of cryptanalysts had achieved the impossible. They had partially broken Japan's main naval code, known as JN-25. This intelligence coup gave Admiral Nimitz an incredible advantage. He knew Yamamoto's entire plan. He knew the Japanese were targeting Midway. He knew their order of battle, their timetable, and their planned route of approach. As historian Elliot Carlson explains in his book Joe Rochefort's War, this was arguably the single most important intelligence victory of the war. While the Japanese Navy sailed into what they thought was a clever trap, they were actually sailing into a perfectly prepared American ambush. Breaking the code was not easy. The JN-25 code was complex, and the Japanese changed it regularly. Rochefort's team worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and sheer determination. They couldn't read every message perfectly, but they could piece together enough fragments to understand the bigger picture. One of the key breakthroughs came when they needed to confirm that the mysterious Japanese objective AF was in fact Midway. They devised a clever trick. They had the garrison at Midway send a false message in plain English that their water purification system was broken. A few days later, they intercepted a Japanese message saying that AF was short on fresh water. The trap was confirmed. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz could position his forces perfectly. He knew he was outnumbered, so he couldn't afford a straight-up fight. He had to rely on surprise. He placed his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, right on the flank of the approaching Japanese fleet, in a position they would never expect. He was able to set the terms of the engagement. He could wait for the Japanese to strike Midway and then hit their carriers when their planes were away and their decks were vulnerable. Without the codebreakers, the Battle of Midway would likely have been a disaster for the United States. And the American fleet might have been surprised and destroyed. Midway would have fallen. The Japanese defensive perimeter would have been extended to the Central Pacific. The entire course of the war could have been different. The work of Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo demonstrates that wars are not only won by sailors and pilots, but also by linguists and mathematicians. Their intellectual victory was the essential prerequisite for the naval victory that followed. Despite what we know, some mysteries about the code-breaking effort remain. How much of Rochefort's final intelligence assessment was based on hard evidence from the intercepts, and how much was his own brilliant intuition filling in the gaps? Were there any dissenting voices in Washington who doubted his conclusions? And how close did they come to overriding Nimitz's decision? And perhaps most chillingly, how close did the Japanese come to realizing that their most secret communications were being read by the enemy? Number 8, was it skill or was it just luck? The Battle of Midway was a victory of skill, intelligence, and bravery. But it was also a victory of incredible, almost unbelievable luck. At several key moments, the battle could have tipped in the other direction. A few minutes here, a different decision there, and the outcome might have been a catastrophic American defeat. Consider the morning of June 4th, 1942. The first American attacks on the Japanese fleet were a disaster. and torpedo bombers from the carriers, Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, and from Midway Island itself, flew in without fighter protection. They were slow, vulnerable, and pressed their attacks with suicidal courage. Of the 41 torpedo planes that attacked, almost all were shot down. They scored no hits. This attack, however, had an unintended consequence. It pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the defending Zero fighters, down to sea level to deal with the torpedo planes. This left the skies at high altitude wide open. And it was at that exact moment that American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. The dive bomber squadrons had been searching for the Japanese carriers and were running low on fuel. The squadron from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, had been about to turn back when McCluskey, on a hunch, decided to follow a lone Japanese destroyer. That destroyer led him directly to Nagamo's fleet. The timing was perfect. The American dive bombers screamed down out of the sun onto Japanese carriers that were completely exposed. Their fighter cover was out of position. Their decks were cluttered with planes, fuel lines, and bombs as they prepared to launch their own strike. In the space of about 5 minutes, the dive bombers hit and mortally wounded 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. It was a devastating, decisive blow. Walter Lord's classic account is aptly titled, "Incredible Victory for a Reason." Was it skill that led McCluskey to the Japanese fleet, or was it a lucky guess? Was it a brilliant American tactic to have the torpedo planes draw the Zeros down, or was it a tragic, uncoordinated sacrifice that just happened to work out? The answer is probably a mix of both. The bravery of the torpedo pilots was a skill. The persistence of McCluskey was a skill. But the perfect timing, the clear skies above, the vulnerable state of the Japanese decks, much of that came down to pure dumb luck. The battle rested on a knife's edge. It was a chain of events so improbable that it feels like fiction. A 5-minute window decided the fate of the Pacific War. The role of chance at Midway raises unsettling questions. What if McCluskey had not followed that destroyer and had turned his squadron for home as planned? What if the torpedo planes had attacked 10 minutes later, after the dive bombers had already been forced to leave due to low fuel? And looking at the Japanese side, what if the Tone scout plane had launched on time and warned Nagamo an hour earlier? The line between a turning point and a catastrophe was razor thin. Number 7, did the sinking of one zombie ship change everything? The story of the USS Yorktown is the story of the Battle of Midway in miniature. It is a story of damage, desperation, incredible repair work, and sacrifice. And its presence at the battle was absolutely crucial to the American victory. Without the Yorktown, the United States would have been down to just 2 carriers against Japan's 4. The odds would have been much longer. The Yorktown had been badly damaged just a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. She had been hit by a bomb that caused extensive damage, limping back to Pearl Harbor. Initial estimates said she would need at least 90 days of repairs in a dry dock. Admiral Nimitz did not have 90 days. He knew the Japanese were coming to Midway, and he needed every flight deck he could get. He told the shipyard workers they had 3 days. What followed was a miracle of engineering and sheer will. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the Yorktown. They worked around the clock, patching the hull, repairing electrical systems, and fixing the flight deck. They didn't have time to do everything perfectly, they just had to make her battle-worthy. When she sailed out of Pearl Harbor on May 30th, still trailing an oil slick, and with repair crews still on board finishing their work, it was a testament to the desperate urgency of the moment. The Japanese intelligence network had reported the Yorktown as sunk or permanently disabled after the Coral Sea. Her appearance at Midway was a complete surprise and a major shock to them. During the battle, the Yorktown played a vital role. Her scout planes were the ones that found the 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, after it had launched the strikes that would eventually cripple the Yorktown herself. And her dive bombers, along with those from the Enterprise, were the ones that delivered the fatal blows to the Soryu. Even after being hit by 3 bombs and brought to a dead stop, her crew managed to get the fires under control and get her moving again. She was hit again, this time by 2 torpedoes, and the order was given to abandon ship, but she refused to sink. She was a zombie ship, absorbing punishment that should have destroyed her. She was eventually sunk a few days later by a Japanese submarine while under tow, but by then her job was done. Her presence had evened the odds. Her planes had helped sink 2 Japanese carriers. Her stubborn refusal to die had absorbed 2 separate Japanese air attacks, drawing fire that might have otherwise been directed at the Enterprise or Hornet. The story of the Yorktown is the ultimate example of how one ship, and the determination of the people who sailed and fixed her, could make a decisive difference. The incredible saga of the Yorktown leaves us with some big questions. How much do the shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor truly understand about the stakes of their race against time? What was the real state of the ship when she sailed into battle? Was she even more fragile than the official reports suggest? And if the Yorktown had not been at Midway, could the 2 remaining American carriers have survived and won against the full force of Nagamo's 4? Number 6, how did the battle expose Japan's flawed grand strategy? Every military action is supposed to serve a larger political or strategic goal. The Japanese Navy's obsession with a single decisive battle, a concept they called Kantai-Kessen, was the core of their strategy. This idea had been ingrained in their naval doctrine for decades, ever since Admiral Togo's stunning victory over the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. The entire Japanese Navy was designed and trained to fight and win one climactic battle that would crush the enemy's will to fight. Midway was supposed to be that battle. The problem with this doctrine is that it put all of Japan's eggs in one basket. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. Yamamoto's plan for Midway was the ultimate expression of this thinking. It was designed to lure the American fleet into a single, decisive engagement where the superior skill and spirit of the Japanese Navy would prevail. He wasn't just trying to take an island, he was trying to win the entire war in one afternoon. The defeat at Midway showed just how brittle this strategy was. When the decisive battle was lost, Japan had no plan B. Their entire strategic framework collapsed. They had lost their primary offensive weapon, the First Air Fleet, and they had no way to replace it quickly. They had bet the Empire on a single roll of the dice and they had lost. This contrasts sharply with the American approach. The U.S. was not looking for a single knockout blow. They were preparing for a long, grinding war of attrition. Their strategy was based on their overwhelming industrial strength. They knew they could lose ships and planes and still win because they could build more. Their goal at Midway was not to win the war, but to survive and to blunt the Japanese offensive. By winning, they did much more than that, but their underlying strategy was more resilient and realistic. As historian Craig Simons points out, in the Battle of Midway, the U.S. was playing the long game, while Japan was playing for a single jackpot. After Midway, Japan was forced to abandon its offensive Kantai-Kessen strategy. It shifted to a defensive, attritional posture. But this was a war of attrition it could not win. It was now fighting the kind of war that America was perfectly suited for. The failure at Midway was not just a tactical failure, it was a strategic catastrophe. It revealed that Japan's entire theory of how to win the war was fundamentally flawed. They had planned for a sprint, but the battle turned the conflict into a marathon, a race they were industrially unequipped to run. This raises profound questions about Japan's pre-war planning. Did senior naval leaders like Yamamoto truly believe the Kantai-Kessen doctrine would work against an industrial power like the United States? Were there any alternate strategic voices in the Japanese Navy who advocated for a different, more sustainable approach, such as a war on commerce? And how did the legacy of the victory at Tsushima 37 years earlier blind a generation of naval officers to the new realities of industrial warfare? Number 5, did this battle prove a new way of war? For centuries, naval power meant big ships with big guns. The battleship was the queen of the seas. A nation's strength was measured by how many battleships it had. But by 1942, a new weapon was challenging this old order, the aircraft carrier. The Battle of Midway was the moment the carrier definitively replaced the battleship as the primary capital ship of modern navies. It's a striking fact of the battle that the opposing surface fleets never saw each other. The fighting was done entirely by aircraft, launched from carriers hundreds of miles apart. Battleships were present on both sides, including Japan's mighty Yamato, the most powerful battleship in the world. But they were irrelevant. They sailed around, spectators to a new kind of warfare being fought in the air. Their big guns never fired a single shot at an enemy ship. The battle was a brutal confirmation of what some naval thinkers like American General Billy Mitchell in the 1920s had been saying for years: a ship at sea was vulnerable to attack from the air. At Midway, 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers and 1 American carrier were sunk entirely by carrier-based aircraft. The dive bomber in particular proved to be an incredibly effective ship killer. The SBD Dauntless, though slow, could deliver a 1,000-pound bomb with pinpoint accuracy, turning a steel flight deck into a raging inferno. The U.S. Navy had been developing its carrier doctrine throughout the 1920s and 1930s. They saw the carrier not just as a support vessel, but as the centerpiece of the fleet. Midway was the ultimate validation of this theory. It proved that a well-handled carrier task force could project power over vast distances and destroy an enemy fleet without ever coming within sight of it. The commanders who won the day, Fletcher and Spruance, were carrier admirals. They understood this new form of warfare. For the Japanese, the lesson was more painful. They too had embraced carrier aviation and had used it with devastating effect at the start of the war. But their naval leadership was still deeply rooted in battleship culture. Admiral Yamamoto commanded the Midway operation from the bridge of the Yamato, 500 miles behind the carrier force. He was too far away to influence the battle directly. His powerful battleships were a fleet in being, but not a fleet in action. After Midway, the supremacy of the carrier was undeniable. The age of the battleship was over. The war in the Pacific would be a carrier war, and the nation that could build and operate the most carriers would win. We are still left to wonder about the doctrinal debates within the world's navies. How close was the U.S. Navy to sticking with a battleship-centric fleet before the war? Inside the Japanese Navy, how much resistance was there from the traditional big-gun admirals to the rise of aviation? And if battleships had somehow played a decisive role at Midway, would the evolution of naval warfare have followed a completely different path through the 20th century? Number 4, who really won the Battle of the Coral Sea? To understand why Midway was such a turning point, you have to look at the battle that happened just 1 month before it, the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in early May 1942. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never fired on each other. It was a carrier versus carrier fight, a dress rehearsal for Midway. And its outcome, though messy, set the stage for the American victory in June. Tactically, the Battle of the Coral Sea could be seen as a victory for Japan. They sank the large American fleet carrier USS Lexington. They also sank a destroyer and an oiler. In return, the Americans sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho. On a simple scoreboard of ships sunk, Japan came out ahead. This is how they reported it at the time. They claimed a major triumph, but strategically, the battle was a victory for the United States. It was the first time a Japanese offensive had been stopped. Their plan was to invade Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would have put them in a position to threaten Australia. The battle forced them to turn back. This was a huge psychological boost for the Allies. It showed that the Japanese were not invincible. More importantly, for the upcoming Midway battle, the Coral Sea had a direct impact on the number of carriers available on both sides. The Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku was badly damaged by American bombs and had to return to Japan for extensive repairs. She was not available for Midway. The carrier Zuikaku was not damaged, but her air group had suffered heavy losses. So many of her skilled pilots and planes were lost that she could not be made ready in time for Midway either. So, while Japan won the tactical fight, the cost was 2 of their frontline fleet carriers removed from the board for the most important battle of the war. This is a key point often overlooked. The Japanese entered the Midway operation with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, instead of the 6 they would have had otherwise. The Americans lost the Lexington, but the damage to the Yorktown, as we've seen, was repaired in a heroic effort. The net result of the Coral Sea was that it reduced the Japanese carrier advantage from 6-3 down to 4-3. This made the odds at Midway much more even. As the book The First South Pacific Campaign by John B. Lundstrom argues, the strategic cost of the Coral Sea for Japan was far higher than the tactical gain. It was a victory that helped them lose the war. Many questions still surround this preliminary battle. How accurate were the damage assessments on both sides in the immediate aftermath? Did the Japanese Navy truly not have enough replacement pilots to reconstitute the Zuikaku's air group in a month, or was this a failure of their system? And if the Shikaku and Zuikaku had been present at Midway, giving Japan a 6-3 carrier advantage, Would any amount of American code breaking and luck have been enough to win? Number 3. How did Midway allow America to fight a global war? The Battle of Midway wasn't just a Pacific battle. Its outcome had global consequences. It allowed the United States to pursue its chosen grand strategy for the entire war, Europe first. From the beginning, American and British strategic planners had agreed that the primary effort should be directed at defeating the Axis powers in Europe. The Pacific was to be a secondary, holding theater until the war in Europe was won. In the first 6 months after the war started, this strategy was in serious jeopardy. The rapid Japanese advance across the Pacific created a crisis. There was immense public and political pressure to divert more resources to fight Japan. If the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been destroyed at Midway, the Europe First strategy might have become politically and militarily impossible. The American West Coast would have been threatened, the supply lines to Australia would have been cut. The U.S. would have been forced to shift its focus and its resources to the Pacific out of sheer necessity. The victory at Midway stabilized the situation. It stopped the Japanese advance cold. It removed the immediate threat to Hawaii and the U.S. mainland. It secured the vital supply lines to the Allies in the South Pacific. By blunting Japan's offensive capability, Midway gave the United States the strategic breathing room it needed. It allowed President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his military chiefs to stick to their Europe First plan. The resources, ships, and men could continue to flow to Great Britain to prepare for the eventual invasion of Europe. Furthermore, the victory at Midway allowed the United States to go on the offensive in the Pacific much sooner than anyone had expected. Just 2 months after Midway, in August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This marked the start of the first major American counteroffensive of the war. This would have been unthinkable if the battle at Midway had been lost. A defeat at Midway would have meant years of defensive attritional warfare in the Pacific, slowly rebuilding the fleet. Instead, the U.S. was able to seize the initiative. It could now choose the time and place of the next battle. From Guadalcanal onward, the U.S. would be on the attack, pushing Japan back across the ocean island by island. Midway was the pivot point that allowed this strategic shift. It ended the defensive phase of the Pacific War and began the offensive phase. It was a crucial prerequisite for the island hopping campaign that would eventually lead to victory. And by securing the Pacific, it ensured that the full might of American industry and manpower could be brought to bear against the enemy in Europe in accordance with the Allies' grand strategy. The global implications of the battle still spark debate. How much pressure was Roosevelt really under to abandon Europe first before Midway, and would a defeat have broken the Anglo-American strategic alliance? To what degree did the victory at Midway accelerate the timeline for the invasion of North Africa in late 1942? And if Japan had won, could they have linked up with their allies in the Indian Ocean, fundamentally changing the strategic map of the entire World War? Number 2, did 4 sunken hulls topple an empire? The raw numbers of the Battle of Midway tell a stark story. The United States lost 1 fleet carrier, the USS Yorktown. They also lost 1 destroyer and about 150 aircraft. Japan lost 4 of its best fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They also lost a heavy cruiser and about 248 aircraft. In terms of simple tonnage and raw power, the exchange was overwhelmingly in America's favor. But the loss of those 4 specific carriers was more than just a number. It was a catastrophic blow from which the Japanese Navy never recovered. These were not just any 4 ships. They were the heart of the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet. This was the force that had attacked the American naval base in Hawaii, that had sunk British battleships off Malaya, and that had raided into the Indian Ocean. It was the most powerful and experienced carrier force in the world. And in one day, it was wiped out. The 4 carriers were more than just ships. They were integrated weapons systems. They carried the best aircraft and, as discussed, the most experienced pilots. The loss was total. The ships, the planes, and the core of the veteran air crews were all gone. As noted before, Japan's industrial base could not replace the ships quickly. Its pilot training program could not replace the men. The loss was permanent. After Midway, the naval balance of power in the Pacific shifted dramatically. Before the battle, Japan had a clear superiority in carrier strength. After the battle, the 2 sides were roughly equal. But this was an equality that would not last long. The flood of new American Essex-class carriers was just about to begin. Japan had lost its margin of superiority at the exact moment it needed it most. It could no longer dominate the seas. The loss of the 4 carriers had a cascading effect on every subsequent operation. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began just 2 months later, was a brutal, grinding battle of attrition. Japan's inability to provide powerful carrier support to its troops on the island was a major factor in their eventual defeat there. In later carrier battles, like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy could put new carriers to sea, but they were crewed by inexperienced pilots. They were no match for the now veteran American carrier pilots. The sinking of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu was the single most decisive material loss of the entire Pacific War. It was the point of no return. It ripped the heart out of the Japanese Navy's offensive power. The Empire's expansion was built on the projection of power from these 4 flight decks. When they slipped beneath the waves of the Pacific, they took Japan's hopes for victory with them. But were there other factors that made the loss of these specific ships so devastating? How much of the Japanese Navy's command and control structure was lost with Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi? If Japan had managed to save even one of the 4 carriers that day, would it have been enough to change the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign? And did the design of the Japanese carriers, with their semi-enclosed hangars, make them more vulnerable to catastrophic explosions than their American counterparts? Number 1. Why did the balance of power shift in just 5 minutes? It all comes down to this. The reason Midway is the true turning point is because of the sheer speed and decisiveness of the change. The strategic situation in the Pacific did not gradually shift. It snapped, it broke. And it happened in about 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th, 1942, starting around 10:20 a.m. Before 10:20 a.m., Japan was winning the battle and the war. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force was the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. They had successfully attacked Midway Island. They had fought off waves of uncoordinated American air attacks, shooting down dozens of planes. They had finally located the American fleet. They were in the process of rearming their planes for a strike that, if successful, would have almost certainly destroyed the American carriers and won the battle. At that moment, Japan was on the verge of achieving its strategic goals. Then, at 10:20 a.m., dive bombers from the USS Enterprise appeared overhead. A few minutes later, they were joined by bombers from the USS Yorktown. In the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, the war changed forever. 3 bombs smashed into the flight decks of the Kaga, the Soryu, and Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi. The Japanese carriers, caught at their most vulnerable moment, were turned into infernos. Their decks were packed with planes, fuel hoses, and munitions. The American bombs acted as detonators for massive secondary explosions. In those 5 minutes, the core of Japanese naval power was broken. 3 of their 4 frontline carriers were knocked out of the war. The balance of power, which had been so heavily in Japan's favor, was suddenly and irrevocably altered. It is rare in military history for a single brief engagement to have such a profound and immediate strategic impact. Most turning points are a series of battles or a long campaign. Midway was an event. It happened in an instant. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial attack and launched 2 strikes that crippled the Yorktown. But she was a dead ship sailing. Later that afternoon, American planes found her and sent her to the bottom as well. But the decisive moment was that 5-minute window in the morning. Everything that came after in the battle and in the war was a consequence of that brief, violent exchange. This is why Midway stands apart from other important battles like Guadalcanal or Stalingrad. Those were long, grinding campaigns of attrition that marked a turning point over months. Midway was a lightning strike. It was a singular event that reversed the tide of the war in a single morning. It was the moment the hunter became the hunted. After those 5 minutes, Japan was no longer on the offensive. It was fighting for its life, and it was a fight because of what happened at Midway that it could not win. The final and perhaps most profound questions are about this moment. Can we pinpoint the single decision or the single piece of luck that made those 5 minutes possible? How did the commanders and sailors on both sides process such a rapid and total reversal of fortune in the heat of battle? And in the entire history of warfare, has there ever been another 5-minute period that so completely altered the strategic course of a global conflict?